So, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me here to your wonderful country and to this wonderful university. We know the University of Singapore very well as a great champion of social work and social work research, and it's a great honour to be here among such distinguished guests. And indeed, everybody is a distinguished guest. I'm going to touch on social work practice research, which is something, as the lady introducing me said, I'm interested in, partly because I think it's the cutting-edge research in social work and indeed in many other professions, and also because I think it has the capacity to make a very real difference to the lives of the people we intend to serve. You can see from this introductory slide that I'm based at King's College in London. King's does not run an undergraduate or a postgraduate qualifying course. That's done by and neither do our neighbours, London School of Economics anymore, but we are in touch with many, many universities that do, and we also run a very large programme of continuing professional development. So every week we have connections with people in practice, and one of the great joys of my life is to go out and see people in practice rather than coming to the university. We go to them, and that is very constructive, I think, in many ways. I'm going to touch on a number of topics relevant, I hope, to today's proceedings. I'm going to discuss whether I think social workers are natural researchers. Perhaps you'll gather that I do. I'm going to think about embedding research in practice and indeed embedding practice in research, which is not often done. I think there's a case for thinking about receptivity in research among social workers and among their managers and among the people who pay for their services. There is also something about being research literate, which doesn't mean swallowing great equations or algorithms, but being able to understand what people mean by something like a randomized control trial. I'll present some examples, which I find probably the most compelling bit of this presentation, and then I'll think about how researchers need to support people in practice, because it isn't just a one-way street. So I thought I'd start with a picture. This is a picture taken 10 days ago. We're all looking very smart because we are launching something called the James Lind Alliance into Priority Setting for Social Work Research with Adults. That is a very long title, but it's a title which has a great deal of meaning because for the first time in England, and indeed probably globally, we're trying to say what questions need to be answered in social work research with adults. In England, probably contrary to many other countries, children and adult services are split. You might think that's slightly curious, because clearly children have families and families have children, but that just is the way our government is organised. We chose to focus on social work with adults, and the lady in the front is our Australian-born, but now British, chief social worker for adults. And she has been asking for some time, what questions do we want to know? What matters? What's the priority? And we've set together a group that has its origins in health services research to say what are the key issues that need to be addressed. Because it's no good having 1 million questions, you need to find them down, and then indeed you need to persuade funders that they need researching. This process is going to take about 18 months, but it involves not just academics. In fact, the academics are in very much a minority. They're almost a protected species in this group. We are probably outnumbered by service users and carers. We're certainly outnumbered by practitioners, and then there are some social work managers there as well. There are representatives from the British Association of Social Workers, the professional grouping, and the academics are there really to serve and to ask the difficult questions. One of the great joys about being an academic researcher is that you can ask the difficult questions and your job is not so much at risk or your reputation so damaged by appearing to be rather stupid. So, moving from that, and I think you can see that I'm quite keen. Research is not always a question of getting out there and doing experiments and asking people difficult things, but actually a process of thinking and reflection. I'm going to offer 3 reasons why I think social workers are probably natural researchers. To me, having read applications for social work programs for many years, numbers and numbers of them, what stands out, I think, is that many social workers have in them a sense of curiosity. They want to know the why. and they want to know in what circumstances, and they want to know what is the effect. They've got a curiosity gene within them. They want to know why things occur to one family and not to another, why something that seems to work for one child does not work for another, why something that appears to be a good system can often have its drawbacks. So I think that is always what I look for in research, in my colleagues and in my PhD students, is that sense of curiosity, because that keeps you going in the quiet of the night. It keeps you going when your motivation dips, when things get very difficult, and also you can remember why you started on the endeavour that you are embarking upon. Social work often has to discuss whether it's an art or a science or part of the humanities, and probably the get-out clause is that it combines all three, that everybody in social work has a great sense of humanity, but they are reflective of the sciences, both the clinical but also the social sciences, and increasingly now, I think many of them recognise that the arts have a very underserved role in social work, but the arts have a lot to offer. They have much to offer in terms of resilience, they have much to offer in terms of creativity, they have much to offer in terms of healing, and we ignore them at our peril. So by arts, I don't mean the great arts of classical music and painting and so on their own. I mean things which are very popular in British social workers at the moment, such as knitting. Knitting is an art as well as a science, and indeed quite difficult. Thirdly, I think social workers aren't afraid to challenge. That doesn't mean that they're hypercritical, although their colleagues might think they are sometimes, but their curiosity and their sense of investigative journalism, their sense of trying to lift up stones to see what is really going on underneath, means that they have the ability to challenge, and that is what we want in research. That is where we look for the people who will say, this theory doesn't work in practice. My experience is very different from that which is reported in the professional or the academic press. I don't think that that is the outcome that we are looking for. It is something more different for people. Outcome is a great word that's used a lot in the UK at the moment, and I presume in Singapore, but there is debate over whether or not an outcome is exactly shared sometimes by service users and carers and by professionals, and we'll touch on that later. How do we know this, that social workers are like this? Other professionals tell us so. We know a little bit about what professionals think of each other. For many social workers, it's not entirely complimentary, but when they do talk about us, we're quite pleased to be noticed. So embedding research into practice isn't easy. Here are some of the things that people tell me why my research isn't very helpful. They say that it's hard to translate to practice because it's not specific enough, that somehow work done in one hospital or in one prison or in one family centre cannot translate to another. And I think we have to listen to that and try and understand what is behind it. I'm not pretending it does, but I do think it does apply more than many people think. And indeed, I think there are many international comparisons to be made that are extremely helpful. Researchers are often criticised, particularly in the social sciences, for not being conclusive. They will say, it indicates, it suggests, it appears that, when people would really have a conclusion which says, do this, do that in these circumstances and spend this amount of money on something. But life isn't very conclusive. Our families are not concluding organisations. Our emotions are not conclusive. It fits with the task and the ambience of social work to offer that multifaceted approach to life, which sees things from different perspectives and at different times and knows that there is a lot of change. Social work research is also accused of not being contextual, that somehow or other it doesn't understand the greater context in which a practitioner works with an individual or their family. Clearly that's so, because when we're writing about one intervention, we have to take the context into account. But if we spent all our time on context, we wouldn't get down to the population or the problem, or indeed the intervention. But we know, I think, in social work, that context and indeed culture eats interventions for breakfast, as we say. It is very important in social work to know where the family are living, to know the neighbourhood, but also to know the past. And I think that story we heard today about the past and its influence of the past on families' lives is very compelling, isn't it? About the way that our past affects our families and it affects the societies in which we live. We help run the Social Work History Network in my college, which is a national organisation, and I think it's one of the things I'm most proud, because the History Network has brought together the past of social work in England, mixed as it is, and it is not entirely self-congratulatory. And I'm sure at the university here, you have a history of social work, your alumni, your teachers, and what was taught and why, and how valuable that is to bring it all together. And equally in England, we recently had 100 objects from social work displayed in a museum. Most of you in practice can think what that might be. A lot of people produced memos. They also produced administration documents. But sometimes they produced letters from clients and letters from people with whom they'd worked, saying what a difference that had made to their lives. And again, I think those visible, sometimes artistic representations are really helpful for the profession. Other criticisms of social work research are that it is difficult to change one person's practice without changing the whole system. And indeed, social work can think systems. We can talk to our colleagues in the business school and other systems theorists about how systems need to change, because it may not be the individual practitioner who needs to change, it's the system within which they work. And here is a criticism that comes from our medical colleagues, but also is applicable to social work. That is that from bench to bedside takes far too long. That means, of course, in medical contexts, it's about a new procedure or a new drug or a new intervention in some ways. In social work, I suppose our equivalent of that would be from pilot to procedures, takes far too long, so that things change. We need to speed up that process, but we also need to listen carefully to the process, because we probably learn a lot more from feasibility studies than we think, rather than rushing ahead with all practitioners going, we told you it wouldn't work. Then lastly, research in practice is everybody's baby, and therefore it's nobody's baby. And one of the things we've learnt from the UK is having people who are champions of research who see that their role is to advocate within their organisation for the use of research, but for them to remain fully grounded in practice. And we're currently running a programme on that at the moment. My slide has slipped a little, partly to show you that I do like going to the cinema, and also what we would call la-la land, a land perhaps of imagination, not too much in touch with reality. So part of the problem that we address in the UK, and I think you may find some resonance with in Singapore, is that research doesn't get embedded in practice. Pilots or experiments. In the UK, we've also termed such things demonstrator sites. Are often set in an unreal world with no competing priorities. A British social scientist said recently that all pilots work, otherwise they don't go ahead. And so you learn only a little from pilots if they're not set in the very real world of competing priorities, limited resources, and people who are not always enthusiastic about what's being suggested. So we have been experimenting for a long time in our child welfare with something called signs of safety. And we know that in pilots it works very well. In the real world, this way to help children who are perhaps being abused and maltreated needs to be set in that real world of acute pressures, of staff shortages, and pressures from the courts to get the cases cleared up as soon as possible. Experiments also can be very short term. In social work, we very rarely have longitudinal research. We have shortitudinal research. We try and think that 2 months of something will make a real difference to custom and practice that have been around for several years, that the office culture will suddenly be able to change, that having a meeting means that everybody will do things differently. We know that things don't work like that. I should have said that experiments are short-term in the UK, and they often founder on the long-term problems of our systems, IT systems. I'm sure you don't have those problems here. We have great problems in re-engineering IT systems to accept changes that are going on. That takes a long time. That's our bench-to-bedside problem. Equally, we know that people's research questions are not always clear or applicable to practice. People will come in with research questions that practitioners don't recognise, that they need to try and think about in multiple ways before they can make sense of them in their real world. And the distance between practice and research is always to be borne in mind. And then lastly, what is a good outcome in social work? We know from other researchers, particularly from our health and education colleagues, that sometimes their outcomes are not the same as ours. I worked on a long study on children's social work where it appeared to me that the main outcome appeared to be whether the child had been to the dentist. I'm sure that was really, really valuable for the child and their teeth and probably made a great difference. But probably the social work's responsibility was not to be the person who encouraged dental care. It was something a little bit more profound and a little bit more difficult than that. But that seemed to be the main outcome that we could get a grip on. Secondly, an example is from older people's services, where I do a lot of work, is that for many people, a negative outcome is seen as a move to a care home, a residential home, a nursing home. Whereas for families, sometimes that is the best thing that can happen. It will save relationships. The person will not be neglected. The person will be happier. They'll have a better quality of life. But if our colleagues see admission to long-term care institution as the problem, then we in social work have to work round that, and sometimes the research is not meaningful to us. And just to draw another example from child protection, to reduce neglect is an outcome that, of course, everybody would want. But how do you measure reductions in neglect? What is the outcome that you could help to build up the series of indicators that that was no longer happening? So agreement needs to be cast there, and practitioners, I think, have a huge role in that, in saying that outcomes are multiple and various within social work, and not always those of our colleagues. And here is an example of something we don't see much nowadays. It's a book. There are great shortages of books now. People are keeping them at home, working in open plan offices within universities. No longer can we reach to our shelves. But they are important, and they're just there as a legacy. So being research receptive is something that I think social workers who are in practice need to address very carefully and think about, are they receptive, as well as being curious, sometimes cynical, and sometimes critical. The questions that people ask me are these, typically. Why should a social worker bother to look at research? It won't tell me the answer. And indeed, it will appear rather distant from what I will do. To resolve that problem, probably the last thing I would give them is a book of theory or an article, because that will not get through that slight resistance. We're working a lot in the UK on things like tweets and blogs. I never thought I would be able to say those things, but we do. And it is astounding how many people will read a tweet and follow that up, compared to being given an article either electronically, that they won't open the page. But a tweet and a blog will entice them in if you can think of the right 140 characters to do so. Less authority, More authenticity. And I think that old status of the academic and the researchers knowing everything and passing our knowledge on has really changed. We are learning from practitioners their language, their interests, their obsessions, and have to reflect that in the work they do. So here underneath in the italics are some words that people use about academic research. It is too long. 80,000 word research reports will only be read by your mother. It is too waffly. Sentences which go on for at least 10 lines and contain many subordinate clauses and don't really get to the point are too many. There is too much in social work reporting the methods. If you want your conference to fall asleep, have several slides of methods, most of which are unintelligible and in too small writing. And social work researchers are guilty of this. Again, there's that indecisive, it all depends. It would indicate, it appears that. Say what we mean and say, we don't know. And of course, most researchers end with two things. More research is needed. And the second one, in words that you could probably encapsulate, is please send me a check. Because it is more research is needed, and I would like to do it. So we have all read those articles. I thought now that we'd turn to three people who I know well, because I've worked with them as practitioner researchers, and introduce you to them. The first is Elaine, who came on a course and wanted to do her thesis, her dissertation, as a part-time student, and didn't know what to do. And so in conversation, within her own work setting, she talked about working in a care home when a resident with Alzheimer's or dementia thinks another resident is their spouse and starts to hold hands with them and generally appear affectionate. Nobody was worried about that. That was nice, people were happy, if both parties were happy to sit there watching TV, holding hands, appearing to have some quality of life from that. The trouble and the puzzles arose about what you did when the partner of one of those residents came and saw their wife or their husband of 50, 60 years holding hands with another person. What do you think the relative is? I think the relative, as Elaine said, we're worried that they're going to be upset. We're worried that they won't let their husband or wife come to the facility anymore. We're worried that they think we're encouraging bad or immoral behaviour. We don't know what to do. She thought that in her small area of South London, this was just a one problem that nobody else had ever faced before. And she spent some time talking about it, whose problem it was, what was going on, was it anything that the staff should do, how should they respond. And so partly one of the things we did was say, do you know, Elaine, I think some other people might have done some work on this. And she did spend some time looking at the literature in a really scientific way and discovered that while a lot of this behaviour might be seen as challenging behaviour and sometimes seen as overtly sexualised behaviour in dementia, there were numbers of researchers all around the world. Spain was one example, Australia, the United States, whereby people had said, yes, we've had such a situation happening and this is how we've dealt with it. So without having to do any research, Elaine found that that was not just a problem in her care home in that small part of South London, but was a problem that was widely shared. It wasn't the major problem, but people were writing about it. So what did Elaine do? Elaine decided she would like to do some research on this topic, but we thought about it in terms of the ethics of doing it. How could she do this? What should she do? Could she talk to family carers without being very intrusive? Could she make them worry? All the ethical points that you do in research. And so I suggested to her that she used what we call vignettes, which is just a smart word for saying it's a little story. And we gave devised a little story about somebody living in a care home whose whose wife came in one day and found her husband holding hands with another woman. And she talked to and recruited some caregivers and said, this is a story about somebody else. What do you think? What would you do? What do you think the staff should do? What do you think the people around this area should do? And sought their views. So she wasn't dealing with their own problems too insensitively, but probably addressed some of the things that they had thought about themselves. What did Elaine do with this? Elaine brought it all together, as you do. She wrote it up, as you do. And she has been delivering training to her colleagues about the management of difficult, apparently ethical dilemmas. So there is no solution, there's no answer, yes, no. It's a dilemma that perhaps staff teams need to face, and she talked to people about how to manage that and what carers said they would want to happen in that circumstance. As a result, Elaine has produced 2 articles in an international journal on dementia, probably the first ever from this perspective, so she's made a global difference. And she's also, I think, comfortable now that when she and her colleagues encounter dilemmas, she has a way of thinking about them and thinking them through that has equipped her for the future. Here's another person, Rebecca, who said to me in one conversation, if patient passports are such a good idea, why don't we use them? Patient passports are something that you might be familiar with in other terms. They're used in clinical settings and between clinical settings and homes, whereby information about a person that they can't say and they can't communicate is written down. And we think of it as in the term of a passport. So that, for example, a child with special needs who is profoundly disabled and can't communicate, needs about how they like to be treated, what they like to be called, what they respond to, what they're allergic to, all that information is contained in one document. Fantastic idea, but it does not work in practice. And you can probably think multiple reasons why that does not work. So Rebecca wanted to find out why. She talked to people in that area, and a lot of social work research is about talking to people. They thought that they were a good idea, but could give multiple reasons why they weren't used. They got lost. They didn't always have the right information. What was a patient passport in one area was a totally different document in another area. Nobody agreed what their content should be. Somehow or other, they didn't fit with the electronic systems that people are now operating. So good idea in principle. In practice, they all fell through. So what did Rebecca do? She thought about it with a theory. And this is something I suppose that academics can do, is bring a theory into play and say, Rebecca, I think you're talking about normalization process theory. And she looked at me as though I was mad. Normalization process theory did not figure on her radar. But it's a way of saying, why don't things work when we think they should work? And let's try and get together those ideas and think about them, a bit like force field analysis, which I'm sure people here will be familiar with. So we have not changed the world on patient passports, but we know now that instead of simplistic answers about why people don't use them, that they're careless, that they can't be bothered, there are much more complicated system-wide issues about their use. And Rebecca will continue to work in this area. Lastly is Clare. Clare took a puzzle, and she also looked at people who are forgotten and sometimes invisible in care services. She said, what do our domestic staff, by that she meant the cleaners and the people who serve meals and the cooks, do for our clients? What do they think is going on here? What's going on? We found when we did the literature review that there is almost no research on people who we would call cleaners, domestics and porters. They don't exist, except when Clare talked to them, she worked out that they probably spend more time with users of her service than any professional. They help them with food, they help them to the toilet, they help them with many other things. They know that individual very well, but nobody ever touches upon what they know and indeed how they use what they know in their behaviour with the individuals and their families. So this was a great joy to touch upon something that's new, to touch upon something that other people thought probably wasn't a problem, but certainly was a puzzle. And as a result of that, Clare has asked that members of staff, such as cleaners, the porters and the domestics, come to the training that's offered to everybody else. And they have appreciated that, I hope, also because, of course, as cleaners, domestics and porters, they're very likely to be family caregivers. So any training given to them at work obviously applies outside work and we hope makes a difference to their social situations as well. What did these three examples have in common? I think they have four things, 4 Ps. They talk about other people, not just individual service users and carers, about teams, about localities, about the institutions where they work. They were pressing problems or dilemmas, but they weren't the immediate problems. And one of the things we know in research is that do not give us managerial decisions and say that those are research. If you want to open or close or change something immediately, then research is not the game in town. That should be done afterwards. They were puzzles. That was the question and why the curiosity was there. And then lastly, of course, as an academic or researcher, what I hoped to help to make them do was that it was possible to do them in a short amount of time by taking small areas to study and not doing a £5 million project. Lastly, then, I'll talk about how researchers probably need to change. And most things in life can be summed up by Winnie the Pooh and his conversations, so I can commend you to that. Are academics always easy to work with? Probably not. We have to admit that. And a fund such as this will probably have to change the behaviour of academics and researchers as much as it will have to change the behaviour of practitioners and their managers. Academics and researchers often say they need time. They have the time, but they don't have as many demands on their time as people in practice. So this is one quandary that will need to be addressed. People in practice probably think they know what to do and argue that the amount of preparation for research is probably too long. We talk about going to ethics committees, preparing protocols, thinking about in great detail our interview schedules or our surveys and so on, and we take a lot of time over those. Why, oh why, so much time needs to be taken? Because it does. Because one mistake early on carries on and gets magnified as a research study continues. And then academics, of course, will always like to complicate things by saying there is another way of thinking about it, another way of doing it. Have you thought of this? And does the sums add up? So this initiative, which is slightly obscured here, is this initiative will test academics too. It is not only about testing practitioners. So end thoughts from me. This is a global initiative, the one that's being launched today. We, the rest of the social work global community, will be looking to you to see how it works out, what its successes are, the problems it encounters, and how those are addressed. And what a joy it is to be here today to mark this global initiative. It is a huge investment, and that is important too, really about the confidence that people have in social work in Singapore, that it is deserving of this investment and can take its place with other professions within the university and globally. We need, of course, to ensure that expectations are carefully managed. It is all too easy to say it will change the world when it probably will only make a minor change, good as though that will be. And square that with the problem of having high ambitions, but also accepting that there will be some problems along the line and some researchers and some practitioners will not take advantage of what's available because life is generally like that. But I am confident that the building blocks are in place for a huge and impressive programme of work There is enormous stakeholder commitment, as evidenced in this room and outside from what I've heard. And I can say rather grandly, but honestly, that on behalf of everybody in social work outside Singapore, we do wish this initiative all the best, and we wish you very much that it goes ahead well, and look forward to hearing of its developments. Thank you.